Peace, everybody. This your girl Tiffany here, live in effect. And it's been a while since I done videos. Okay, but I want to get back on here to talk about nature and poetic metaphors. The reason why is because many of us are making a transition from dealing with spirituality and metaphysics, right? And getting to understand scientific knowledge. All right. But, science can be very technical. And what I mean by that is a lot of complicated terms that we're not familiar with or we're not used to hearing. So, in order for us to make sense about the empirical knowledge, oftentimes we try to use metaphors. We use metaphors as a way to help us to understand the meaning, give life some form of meaning, so we can be able to embrace it, to be able to live, to find harmony. All right. So, in my opinion, I believe the best way to understand nature is studying the ancient poets, okay, or the philosophers during the time period before there was natural philosophy, before there was scientific methods. All right. The reason why, because they gave an accurate depiction about nature without necessarily using a lot of religious jargon, without using the concept of God all the time, or using using information, saying things like, for example, about the hellfire and heavens, right? And if they did use those terms, if they use a concept like heaven, it was, again, to use it as a metaphor. All right. So a lot of us are so used to hearing, a lot of us are used to the dogma of religion, right? Hey, peace, how you doing? A lot of us are used to the dogma of religion. All right. So we were taught to see nature or the idea of God as some deity in the sky that's looking down and that's writing down who's been naughty and who's been good. And how that's not how you see nature. Okay? And a lot of people been taught to stay in fear. And that's the problem. Because when we understand this thing called nature, right? Nature is nothing more than the essential qualities of reality. Again, nature is nothing more than the essential qualities of reality. Right? So basically, it's dealing with the physical reality. That's all it is. So if you're wondering, when you talk about nature, Tiffany, what do you mean? Okay, I mean like biology, physics, cosmology, physics. That's what I mean. Geology. That's what I mean. So we talking about planets. We talking about the cosmos. We talking about animals. We're talking about humans. We're talking about plants. That's what I mean. Okay. However, to really fully get into the understanding or adapting the idea of what nature is about, it's best to study the ancient poets. And so you study people like Rumi, for example. Rumi was a mystic. Okay, he was a Sufi mystic, and he wrote a lot of poetry. He wrote a lot of poetry about nature, about love. So he was one of the first poets basically to bring about the inspiration of scientific knowledge as we know of today. So if you read his works, right, or if you ever listen to his works on audio, it goes beyond spirituality. It goes way beyond the concept of worshiping a deity. It's all about to connect and harmonize with nature. Same thing with Taoism. So, in my opinion, Taoism is not really dealing with spirituality. It's more so philosophy. All right, if you really study Taoism, you'll realize that it's more philosophical than it is religious. Again, it gets into harmonizing with nature. So when you learn about the yin and the yang, right? The yin represents the feminine quality, right? However, it represents passive. The yang represents active. So that means the opposite of things that's taking place in nature. So nature has its opposite. All right. So we look at peace and we also look at chaos. But in science, it's equilibrium versus entropy. So entropy in science represents chaos. Equilibrium represents balance. All right. So when you hear the yin and the yang, it talks about opposite. Okay. So everything has its opposite in nature. Also, not only you have to study Rumi, but I would also recommend people to study Lucretius. So Lucretius was another ancient philosopher, a poet from Rome at that time. He was a Latin poet. Lucretius wrote a book called The Nature of Things. Okay, so The Nature of Things, let me just post it up for you guys if you guys can see it. So The Nature of Things basically just get into cosmology, what we call today cosmology, what we know as biology and whatnot. So yeah, that's what his book's dealing with. And also I got the book by Spinoza. All right. And Spinoza is one of the reasons why scientists, right, especially those who are physicists, there are a lot of them that identify this. So the pantheist philosophy came about because of Spinoza. And Einstein was very so influenced by him. Okay. So when people would ask him, well, what is his belief? Do he believe in God? He said, well, I do believe in God. I believe in Spinoza God. And Spinoza said, God is nature. But his concept will be God or nature, right? But the argument is God is nature. There's nothing else outside of that. There is no spookism. There is no supernatural. God itself is nature. And that makes more sense. But here's the interesting thing. People like Spinoza and Galileo, they were exiled from their own community. They were kicked out because they went against religious ideology. All right. They went against the religious institution at the time. Because Galileo argued that the sun was the center of the universe, right? Which is called heliocentric. So the argument was that the earth revolved around the sun. Whereas in the church that he was a part of, they did not believe in that. They believed that the earth was at the center and that the sun revolved around the earth. They believed that the earth was at the center of the universe. But Galileo corrected that and said, no, the sun is at the center and the earth revolves around the sun. So in other words, what he was trying to correct, what he was saying is, as organisms, We rely on the sun for our resources. We rely on the sun for thermal energy. We rely on the sun for life because the plants, in order for them to survive, right, it's gonna take more than just water. It takes the sunlight, which is also known as photosynthesis, okay, which is nothing more than sun energy, thermal energy. So without the sun, the plants won't survive, and without plants, we won't survive as organisms. Okay? So he was persecuted and punished by the church just for going against their ideology, just for questioning their position. And so Spinoza, who happened to be Jewish, okay, the Jewish community went against him because he said God was nature. God is not a supernatural being. God is nature. But now, today, in modern times, scientists look back on their information and say, wow, these people, they were on the right track. They knew what they were talking about. They knew exactly what they were talking about. So they were on the right track. However, they could not, they weren't supposed to reveal what they knew. The church was not ready to rely on scientific knowledge for anything. The Jewish community was not ready for the scientific information. All right, now today, there are some religious institutions, all right, that would teach scientific information along with teaching religion ideology, right? There are some that's doing it because they realize that, well, what good is it going to do just to teach religious doctrine without giving the empirical knowledge? And then some of them, the way they do it, it brings about confusion. Some do it to bring about confusion. Okay. Because they're not giving the scientific information first. As far as dealing with the empirical knowledge. Okay. That's not how they doing it. So they'll give a little bit of the empirical knowledge, then they'll just go into everything else that's dealing with the intuitive knowledge or spirituality, right? Dealing with the whole thing about supernatural. And that could bring confusion. So if a person is going to teach or bring in poetic metaphors, right? Or allegories, you have to teach what is tangible first. You have to teach the scientific information to people first. Okay, so they become familiarized with the science. Then once you get done teaching that information, then you can break it down using metaphors, using allegories to make sure that it will make sense, so that way the person can have an understanding of what the particular knowledge is, okay, or what that information is about, so they can understand physics, they can understand cosmology, they can understand biology, they can understand chemistry. Okay. However, I recommend people to study the ancient poets, study Spinoza, study Lucretius, study Rumi, study Taoism, especially Lao Tzu's. Yeah, study his work. If you get into studying Lao Tzu's work, it will help you to be able to bridge that gap to get the understanding of what nature looks like or what it means to live in harmony in nature. So when you do study the science, you'll be like, okay, now it makes more sense because I read this in a poetry. I read the book by Rumi. I read this book by Lucretius. I read Spinoza work. I read you know, you read a list of Arthur who were ancient poet. You can even look at Ralph Emerson. Ralph Emerson is another one. Um, but he wrote his work. His work came about around the 1800s, though. However, he got into dealing with the poetry of nature. So that's another person that people can look into and study. So it would make sense to balance your knowledge, is what I'm saying. It makes sense to have the empirical information, the empirical data, and also have the knowledge, the metaphorical knowledge, right? Intuitive knowledge, because that way you can better give reverence and awe to nature. So you don't have to necessarily look to a supernatural. And I'm not telling people get away from their religious belief at all. I'm not trying to do that. But you will be able to learn how to accept things for what they are as far as the ultimate reality that we living in, right? You'll be able to accept it. You'll be able to adapt to it. You'll be able to say, okay, this is just how it is. And you'll be able to find not only balance with and harmony in nature, but you also find balance within yourself. You find the balance within because now you understand what it means to harmonize with reality. Now you recognize that there is chaos and there is peace, equilibrium. There is the entropy of nature. You understand the purpose of animals being here, right? You understand the purpose of having plants. You understand why the sun exists. You understand why the stars exist. You understand why the universe is here. You will understand why a tree grows the way they do, right? Why we able to use mobile devices and computers, get up and brush our teeth, while we able to breathe, while we able to meditate. You understand why we able to do the things that we do here on this planet. Why we able to survive? Why do we have the survival skills that we have? You will get the knowledge of understanding why we able to not only have the knowledge skills, but why are we able to come up with numbers? Why are we telling time? Why do we have daylight saving? Why we have a winter time? Why we have a summertime? Why we have a fall? Why we have a spring? There's so many things you can learn about. But I think it's easier to start at the very beginning. Meaning that start off at the rudimentary level. So when we start off with the rudimentary knowledge, then you can work your way up to get into the hardcore information. Okay, get into the technicality of dealing with or learning about nature. All right, but yeah, I would suggest that people just start off at the rudimentary level, at the beginner's level. But one thing I just want to tell people: appreciate nature, appreciate the fact that you are here, and that you do have a role that you play. You are part of the ecosystem. You are a part of the cosmos. You are made of stardust. Okay? It's within. And you are also in the universe. Okay? You are the universe within. And you also within the universe. That was Richard Feynman. He said, I, atoms, is in the universe, and atoms in the universe. Hold on. What he say? I, atoms, are in the universe, and the universe with atoms. Oh, you know what? I might be saying it wrong. Give me a moment. Hold on. Let me go back and requote that. I said it wrong. I said it wrong. Hold on. Let me go ahead and look that up real quick. Let me see. Let me look up Richard Feynman. Let me go back and look that up. Richard Feynman. All right, so the phrase is I, a universe of atoms, and atoms in the universe. Yeah. So he said I, a universe of atoms, right? And an atom, in other words, what he's saying is microcosm and macrocosm. All right. So we are the microcosm of universe, right? And we are the macrocosm within the universe. Okay. So that's like dealing with the law of correspondence. As above, so below. As above, so below, basically. And then you get into the technicality about the atoms coming together in billions and trillions to bring about the emergence of properties. So and then you get into the concept of learning that physics bring about chemistry. Chemistry brings about biology, and biology brings about psychology. Again, physics bring about chemistry, chemistry brings about biology, and biology brings about psychology. And psychology brings about what? Sociology. Okay, somebody put religion and spirituality are two completely different things. Yes and no. Yes and no. And I'm gonna tell you why. I do agree, but I have to disagree. Okay. So I do agree that they are two different things because religion is more institutionalized, right? Whereas spirituality is more about having a relationship and harmony with nature, right? And or just having that relationship with the supernatural power or that higher being. Okay. So yes, they are two different things, but at the same time, they are used interchangeably. Again, at the same time, they are used interchangeably as well. Because at the end of the day, spirituality is attached to religion. Spirituality is associated with religion. But I do understand what you're saying, so I can agree. But that's all I wanted to say, and that's all I wanted to talk about. I hope you all have a wonderful evening. And until next time, to all of you, like I said, you guys, if you want to really get into the understanding of nature, start off at the rudimentary level of knowledge. That means basically study the ancient poets of the time period. I'm going to repeat the names: Rumi, Lucretius, Spinoza, and Ralph Emerson, who came about around the 1800s. Just to name a few, but it's many more out there. Okay. You guys be safe, and I will keep you guys posted. So, peace. All right, and let me show you the books again. Okay. All right. Have a good night.